2 Apache sisters were given to me as servants, and I did the unthinkable. The man never expected that morning to change the shape of his life. He had woken before sunrise, as he always did, to the sound of wind brushing against dry grass and the distant call of birds. The land he now lived on was wide and quiet, stretching farther than the eye could see. It was not a place he had chosen. It was a place he had been given, along with everything on it, after the sudden passing of a relative he barely knew. The letter had arrived weeks earlier, sealed and official. Inside were words that felt heavy even before he understood their meaning: property, responsibility, transfer. The man remembered sitting at his small table, reading the lines again and again, feeling as if someone else's life had been dropped into his hands without warning. He had no choice. There was no one else to take it. So he packed his belongings, left the town where he had grown up, and traveled toward a future that felt uncertain and unwanted. When he arrived at the settlement near the land, people greeted him with polite nods and curious eyes. They spoke quickly, as if assuming he already understood how things worked there. They told him about the fields, the animals, the house that needed repair. Then, almost as an afterthought, one of the men said, "The 2 girls will be with you now." At first, he did not understand. He thought they were talking about workers who lived nearby. He asked where they were from when they would arrive and what they were paid. The men exchanged glances, then laughed softly. One of them shook his head and said, "They're already there." That was when he felt the first twist of discomfort in his chest. He walked toward the house, his boots pressing into dry earth. The building was old but sturdy, shaped by years of hard weather. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, though he had not lit a fire. As he stepped inside, he saw them. 2 young women stood near the far wall. They were close together, shoulders almost touching, as if space itself felt unsafe between them. Their eyes lifted briefly, then dropped to the floor. They did not speak. They did not move. The man paused. Something about the room felt wrong, heavier than the dust in the air. He cleared his throat and introduced himself, saying his name slowly, hoping it might make the moment feel more human. There was no response. The older of the 2 women glanced sideways at her sister, then back down again. He turned to the man who had followed him inside and asked quietly what their names were. "They answer when told," the man replied, shrugging. "You don't need names." That answer stayed with him, pressing against his thoughts long after the other man left. Over the next few hours, the man unpacked his belongings and tried to settle into the house. The sisters moved silently around him, cleaning, preparing food, carrying water. They never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, their voices were barely more than breath. He noticed how they flinched at sudden sounds, how their hands trembled slightly when passing him a bowl or a cup. He told himself it was none of his business how things were done here. He reminded himself that he was new, that he did not understand the customs of the land. Still, something inside him refused to rest. He had grown up poor, but he had grown up free. The idea that people could be handed over like tools or animals made his stomach tighten. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and red, he sat at the table while the sisters stood nearby, waiting. The food was simple but warm. He gestured for them to sit and eat with him. They froze. The younger one shook her head slightly, eyes wide with fear. The older sister stepped forward and whispered something in a language he did not understand. Her voice was calm, but her hands were clenched tight. "It's all right," he said gently. "You can sit. I won't be angry." They did not move. After a long moment, he stood up, pushed his chair back, and stepped away from the table. Only then did they slowly sit, still tense, still watching him as if expecting punishment. That night, sleep did not come easily. The man lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him. His thoughts kept returning to the sisters, to their silence, to the way fear seemed woven into every movement they made. He realized that accepting this arrangement, even without speaking, men agreeing to something he did not believe was right. The next days followed a quiet rhythm. Work began at sunrise and ended when the light faded. The sisters knew the land well. They moved with skill and care, as if the ground itself recognized them. The man watched them from a distance, noticing how they communicated without words, how one always stayed within reach of the other. It was clear they had learned to depend on each other completely. He tried speaking to them again using slow, simple words. He asked where they came from, how long they had been there. At first, they did not answer. Then, one afternoon, the older sister spoke a single sentence, her accent thick but her meaning clear. She told him they had been moved from place to place since they were children. That was all she said. The man did not press for more. He could see the effort it had taken her to speak at all. Still, that small glimpse into their past only deepened his unease. He began to notice how others in the settlement talked about them, about people like them. Their words were casual, almost careless, as if they were discussing weather or crops. No one questioned the system. No one seemed to think it could be different, except him. One evening, a neighbor stopped by and laughed when he saw how the man treated the sisters with distance and respect. He warned him not to be soft, saying that kindness would only make things difficult. The man nodded but said nothing. Inside, his thoughts were racing. He realized that doing nothing would be easier, safer. But easy did not feel right. As the days passed, he felt caught between two worlds. One told him to follow what was expected, to accept what had been handed down without question. The other urged him to see the sisters not as part of an inheritance, but as human beings whose lives had already been shaped by loss. Late one night, he stood outside, looking up at the stars. The land was silent, vast, and indifferent. He thought about the kind of man he wanted to be, about the weight of choices that could not be undone. He knew that whatever he decided next would change everything. Inside the house, the two sisters slept lightly, always alert, always ready. They did not know yet that the man who now held their fate was questioning the very idea that he had the right to do so. And as the wind moved through the open land, carrying the promise of change, the man understood that this was only the beginning of a decision that would test his courage, his place in the world, and his understanding of what it truly meant to do what was right. The days slowly began to reveal what silence had been hiding. At first, nothing seemed different. The sun still rose early, the land still demanded hard work, and the house still felt too large and too quiet. But the man started noticing details he had missed before. Small things, things that only appeared when one stopped looking away. The sisters woke before dawn every day, even when there was no need. He once noticed them already standing outside when he opened the door, as if sleep itself was something they did not trust. Their movements were careful and exact, like people who had learned that mistakes came with consequences. They never argued, never complained, and never asked for anything, not even water when the heat grew unbearable. The man began to feel uneasy watching this. He noticed how the younger sister always waited for the older one before stepping into a room. If the older sister paused, the younger one stopped too. If the older sister looked worried, the younger one's face mirrored that fear instantly. Their bond was strong, built not from comfort but from survival. It was clear they had learned long ago that the world was not gentle, and the only safety they had was each other. One afternoon, while repairing a fence, the man watched them work in the distance. The older sister carried heavy tools without a word. The younger sister followed closely, collecting what was dropped, fixing what came loose. They worked as if they shared one mind. There was no laughter, no pause, just steady motion. That was when the man realized something that unsettled him deeply. They were not quiet because they were calm. They were quiet because they were afraid. That thought stayed with him through the rest of the day and into the night. He remembered moments from his own childhood, times when he had felt powerless, when speaking up only made things worse. The memory left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wondered how long fear could live inside a person before it became part of them. The next morning he tried something small. When the older sister handed him a cup, he said thank you, clearly, gently. Her hands shook. She nodded quickly and stepped back as if waiting for something else to happen. When nothing did, her eyes flicked up for half a second before dropping again. That single moment told him more than words ever could. Later that day, he left a blanket folded neatly near the doorway where they slept. Winter nights were growing colder, and he had noticed how thin their bedding was. He did not say anything. He did not point it out. The blanket remained untouched until late evening. He saw the younger sister reach for it, hesitate, then pull her hand back. Only after the older sister nodded slightly did they take it inside. Even then, they moved as if expecting someone to stop them. The man turned away, his chest tight. He began to understand that kindness alone was not enough. Years of control and loss had taught them that gifts often came with hidden costs. Trust, once broken, did not return easily. Days passed, and slowly the sisters began to speak a little more. Never freely, never fully, but enough for fragments of their story to emerge. They had grown up moving from place to place. Promises had been made and broken. People had decided their future without asking them what they wanted. Each move had taken something from them: family, language, familiar land, until all that remained was each other. The man listened without interrupting. He did not ask questions that might reopen wounds. He simply listened, and in doing so, he felt a growing sense of responsibility that went far beyond the land he had inherited. One evening, a group of settlers gathered nearby. The man overheard their laughter and conversation as he passed. Their words were careless. They spoke about work, weather, and people like the sisters as if they were tools that made life easier. No malice was spoken openly, but the lack of concern was just as heavy. The man felt something twist inside him. He realized that what disturbed him most was not just the sisters' situation, but how normal everyone else believed it was. The system did not survive because of cruelty alone. It survived because of silence. Because people chose comfort over conscience. That night, the man sat alone, staring at his hands. He thought about what it meant to be given power over someone else's life without consent. He had never asked for that power, but now that he had it, refusing to act felt like a choice of its own. The next day, he made another small change. He told the sisters they could decide how the work was divided. He would not command them. He would ask. The words felt strange in his mouth, but he said them anyway. The older sister looked confused. The younger sister looked scared. After a long pause, the older sister nodded and quietly explained how they usually worked best. The man listened and agreed without argument. That moment did something subtle but important. For the first time, the sisters were not just following instructions. They were making decisions. It did not erase fear overnight. They still moved carefully. They still watched his reactions closely, but something shifted. The air felt slightly less heavy. The silence felt less tight. Still, the man knew that these changes were only surface level. Deep down, the larger question remained unanswered. Was he truly different from the others if the foundation of their situation remained the same? The weight of that question grew heavier each day. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by again. He noticed the changes immediately: the shared meals, the lack of orders, the distance the man kept. "You'll make things harder for yourself," the neighbor warned. "People will talk." The man met his gaze calmly. "Let them." The neighbor shook his head and left, muttering about foolishness. As the man watched him go, he realized something important. Fear had controlled the sisters for years, but fear also controlled the settlement. Fear of change. Fear of standing alone. Fear of doing what others might judge. That night, the man stood outside again, looking at the stars. The land stretched endlessly around him, silent and watching. He thought about the difference between following rules and doing what was right. He knew they were not always the same. Inside the house, the sisters sat quietly, sharing the blanket, whispering to each other in soft voices. For the first time, there was a hint of warmth in their space, not just from the cloth, but from the idea that the future might not be exactly the same as the past. The man understood now that seeing the truth was only the beginning. Soon he would have to decide what to do with it, and that decision, he knew, would demand more than kindness. It would demand courage. The change did not happen all at once. It came quietly, hidden inside ordinary days. The man began to notice that the sisters were watching him more closely now, not with fear alone, but with curiosity. They listened when he spoke, even when his words were not directed at them. They noticed how he treated others in the settlement, how he spoke calmly even when disagreements rose. Trust was still distant, but something fragile had begun to form. One morning, while they worked near the edge of the land, the man asked if they would like to take a break. The question hung in the air, unfamiliar and confusing. Breaks were not something they had known before. The older sister looked at the younger one, then back at the ground. "If you wish," the man said softly, "it's your choice." Choice. The word seemed to weigh more than any tool they carried. After a long pause, they sat beneath a tree, keeping their distance but accepting the moment. The man stepped away, giving them space. When he returned later, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. It was quiet and brief, like a sound that had forgotten how to exist. When they noticed him, it stopped immediately. Their faces tightened, ready for reaction. He smiled gently and said nothing. That silence, his silence, meant more than 1,000 reassurances. But not everyone was blind to the changes. The settlement noticed. People whispered. Some watched with suspicion, others with mockery. A few warned him openly. "You're forgetting how things work here," one man said during a supply exchange. "You don't change the order of things without consequences." The man nodded, but inside, his resolve hardened. He was beginning to understand that doing what was right often meant standing alone. The pressure grew heavier when an official figure from the region arrived. He inspected land, asked questions, and noticed the unusual arrangement almost immediately. His tone was polite, but his eyes were sharp. "Everything in order?" the man asked, glancing toward the sisters. "Yes," the owner replied calmly. The official lingered, clearly unsettled by the lack of strict control he expected to see. When he left, his parting words were careful but clear. "Be mindful, people are watching." That night, sleep again refused to come. The man stared into the darkness, replaying every warning, every look of disapproval. He knew now that small kindnesses were no longer enough. The sisters' lives were still bound by a system that saw them as less than free, no matter how gently he behaved. Avoiding the truth would no longer protect anyone. The next morning, he made a decision that frightened him. He asked the sisters to talk. They sat across from him, tense and unsure. He kept his voice slow and steady, choosing his words with care. He told them that what had happened to them was not right, that being handed from one person to another was not how life should work. Their eyes widened. The younger sister looked at the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and punish them all for hearing such words. "I don't want to control your lives," he continued. "I want to understand what you want." The room was silent for a long time. Then the older sister spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one has ever asked us that." The words struck him deeply. She explained slowly, choosing each word carefully as if testing whether they were safe. They wanted safety. They wanted to stop being moved like objects. They wanted to decide where they slept, what they worked on, what tomorrow looked like. Simple wishes, basic things. Things that should never have been denied. As he listened, the man felt a heavy mix of anger and shame. Anger at the system that allowed this. Shame that he had benefited from it, even unwillingly. That afternoon, he rode into town alone. He spoke to people who dealt with records and agreements. He asked difficult questions. Some answered vaguely. Some avoided him. Others laughed and said he was overthinking things. But one older clerk looked at him for a long moment and then spoke quietly. "If you're serious, there are ways. They won't like it. It won't be easy." The man thanked him and left, his heart pounding. The path ahead was becoming clear and dangerous. Back at the land, the sisters sensed the shift immediately. The man was quieter, more focused. He began writing late into the night, reviewing papers, reading laws he barely understood. He was preparing for something, though he had not yet said what. The sisters whispered together, fear and hope mixing in equal parts. Change had never come without pain before. They had learned not to trust it. A few days later, the man spoke again. "I can't promise this will be easy," he said honestly. "And I can't promise people won't try to stop it, but I can promise that I won't turn away." The younger sister's eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. The older sister closed her eyes as if holding onto something fragile. That evening, neighbors arrived unannounced. Their tone was no longer friendly. They accused him of disturbing order, of inviting trouble. One even hinted that accidents happen to those who refuse to follow expectations. The man listened calmly, though fear gripped him tightly. When they left, his hands were shaking, but his resolve remained. He realized something important in that moment. Courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was choosing to act despite it. The next weeks were filled with tension. Every sound felt louder. Every knock on the door raised his heart rate. But alongside the fear, something else grew: clarity. The sisters began to help him, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. They shared knowledge of the land, pointed out mistakes others had made, and offered ideas. Their confidence was still fragile, but it was real. They were no longer just surviving. They were participating. One night, as the man stood outside watching the moon rise, the older sister joined him. She stood a few steps away, respectful but present. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because if I don't, I'll become someone I don't want to be." She nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense. The future was still uncertain. The risks were real. The cost could be high, but something had already changed beyond repair. The man was no longer questioning whether to act. He was preparing to do so. And deep inside, both he and the sisters knew that the next step would cross a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The world around them would not remain the same after that. Neither would they. The morning came slowly, pale light spilling across the fields, and with it, a decision that would change everything. The man had not slept well, but he had thought. He had thought long into the night about fear, about courage, about what it truly meant to do what was right. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, and that people would not understand. Yet, he also knew that waiting or ignoring the truth was no longer an option. He walked quietly to the house, the sisters already moving about in their usual silence. Today felt different. The air was heavier, full of expectation, though no words had been spoken. He called them over, his voice calm, steady, as he had learned to make it in these past weeks. The older sister approached first, her hands folded, the younger one close behind, their eyes wary but attentive. "I have been thinking," he began carefully, "about the life you have lived and the life you deserve. For too long, you have been told that your choices do not matter, that you belong to someone else, not to yourselves." He paused, watching their faces for any sign of reaction. They remained silent, as if holding their breath, waiting for what he would say next. "I cannot undo the past," he continued, "but I can change the future. From today I release you. You are free. You do not have to serve me or anyone else. You can choose your path, your work, your home, your life." For a long moment nothing moved. Then the older sister's eyes widened, disbelief written across her face. The younger one looked at her sister, then at the man, as if checking whether he spoke seriously or if this was some cruel trick. "Free," the older sister whispered, voice trembling. "You mean we are free?" "Yes," he said softly, "free to make your own choices." No one has the right to decide your life but you." Tears gathered in their eyes, though neither of them moved immediately. They looked at each other, then back at him, as if the world had suddenly become larger and yet gentler than they had ever imagined. The man reached for a small bag he had prepared earlier. It contained simple things: clothes, food, tools, and papers that formally recognized their freedom in the settlement's records. He handed it to them, careful not to touch their hands, wanting them to feel independent, capable, and respected. The sisters accepted the bag cautiously, their fingers brushing the fabric as if it were something both familiar and strange. They did not speak for a while, only holding the small bundle close to themselves. The man waited patiently, giving them the time and space that they had rarely been allowed. Outside, the neighbors began to notice. Word traveled quickly through the settlement, as it always did. Whispers began, some incredulous, some mocking, some angry. People called the man foolish. Others questioned why he would disrupt an established way of life. Some even suggested that the sisters would not survive on their own. The man did not respond to any of it. He knew that what he had done was right, even if the world around him did not understand. He focused instead on the sisters, who were slowly beginning to smile, a shy but genuine curve of their lips that had not been seen in years. That day, they stepped outside together for the first time, not as servants, but as individuals with choices. The younger sister walked a few steps ahead, examining the open land, her hands brushing the tall grass. The older sister followed, carrying the bag of supplies carefully. They moved with a mixture of caution and excitement, learning that freedom was not just a word, but a feeling they could finally touch. The man followed them, not leading, not commanding, simply walking alongside. He felt a deep mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that he had done what was right, anxiety for the consequences that were sure to come. The following weeks were filled with small victories and challenges. The sisters began to explore the land themselves, tending small patches, learning to manage their work without direction. Each task completed without command was a step toward confidence. Each decision made by them strengthened the bond of trust that had been so fragile before. But not all attention was kind. Some neighbors looked with suspicion, whispering behind closed doors. Others spread rumors that the man was reckless, that he had overstepped the bounds of tradition. A few even suggested that freeing the sisters would cause trouble in the settlement, as if kindness itself were dangerous. The sisters noticed these reactions and feared the consequences. They had been taught to obey, to stay silent, and now, suddenly, they were allowed to act. The weight of choice was heavy, but the man reminded them gently that the fear they felt was natural, but it should not control them. One afternoon, the sisters approached him with a question. "Where do we go from here?" the older sister asked. The man thought carefully before answering. "Wherever you choose. You can stay here, explore your own future, or leave for a place you want to be. The choice is yours alone. No one else can decide for you." The younger sister looked at him and smiled faintly, a smile that carried both relief and determination. "We will need time," she said softly, "to learn how to decide." "Take all the time you need," the man replied. "There is no rush. Freedom is not a race. It is a journey." In the evenings, they would sit together outside, talking quietly for the first time about things that mattered to them. They shared stories of their past, of places they remembered, of dreams they had almost forgotten. The man listened, offering support without judgment, understanding that his role was not to control, but to guide gently when needed. Neighbors continued to watch and talk. Some came to see the sisters working independently, surprised to witness their skill, intelligence, and resilience. Slowly, a few even began to respect what had been done, realizing that kindness and fairness did not weaken anyone. It strengthened the bonds of the settlement itself. But not everyone accepted it. The man knew he had made enemies. Some resented him for breaking tradition. Some feared change. There were quiet threats, suggestions that freeing the sisters had upset the balance of power, and that actions always had consequences. Yet, in spite of all this, the man felt a quiet strength within himself. He had chosen courage over comfort, humanity over expectation. He had acted despite fear, despite social pressure, despite knowing that the path ahead would not be easy. The sisters began to smile more often, their laughter a rare but precious sound. It was fragile like glass, yet it filled the house with a warmth that had not been there before. The man watched them, understanding that these small moments were the real victory. Not words, not recognition, not approval, but the quiet knowledge that freedom, however new and fragile, could grow. Weeks turned into months, and the settlement slowly adjusted. Some people continued to disapprove, some whispered, some left. Others began to change, noticing that respect and fairness created strength rather than weakness. The sisters learned to navigate their new lives, still cautious, still aware of the world's harshness, but increasingly confident in their own power to choose. And the man, once unsure and hesitant, found peace in knowing that doing the right thing, however difficult, had changed more than the lives of the sisters. It had changed him as well. He understood now that true courage was not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of standing for what is just, even when the world disagreed. At night, as he looked out over the land, the man felt a quiet satisfaction. The wind moved softly across the fields, carrying the promise of a future shaped not by fear, but by choice. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that the world, though still uncertain, was a place where change was possible, and where even the smallest acts of justice could bloom into something enduring. The sisters slept peacefully that night, unguarded, unafraid. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was real, and the man standing in the doorway watching them knew that sometimes the unthinkable is simply the choice to act rightly, even when no one else will. The days that followed were quiet, but they carried a new energy. The sisters moved about the land with a confidence they had never known, testing their freedom in small ways at first. They walked farther, spoke louder, and made decisions that once would have seemed impossible. The man watched them from a distance, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. He had done what he knew was right, and now he was learning the deeper lesson. Freedom, once given, must be nurtured with patience and respect. The first morning, the younger sister went to the garden alone, tending to the small patch of vegetables they had planted together. She worked slowly, her movements deliberate, testing her own ability to make choices without being told what to do. The older sister stayed nearby, observing, learning, and offering advice only when asked. Their relationship had always been strong, but now it was stronger in a different way, not out of necessity but by choice. Neighbors continued to watch, and reactions were mixed. Some were curious, others disapproving. A few had openly criticized the man, calling him foolish for giving the sisters freedom. But those criticisms did not deter him. He understood that real change often makes people uncomfortable. What mattered was not the opinion of the crowd, but the quiet certainty that he had acted rightly. One afternoon, a local merchant came to visit. He had heard the whispers and wanted to see the sisters for himself. When he arrived, he found them working efficiently, communicating with ease and demonstrating skill he had not expected. The merchant's eyes widened in surprise. "I did not think they could manage on their own," he admitted. "I was wrong." The sisters smiled politely but did not seek praise. They were learning that their worth was not determined by others, but by themselves. Each small success, each decision made independently, reinforced their confidence. They began to speak more openly, asking questions, sharing ideas, and even laughing together. A sound so rare and precious that it brought a warmth to the house that had been absent for years. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Some people in the settlement whispered that the man had upset the natural order, that freeing the sisters would create disorder. A few neighbors avoided him, uncertain how to treat someone who had acted so differently. But the man faced these challenges quietly, refusing to argue or seek approval. His actions were guided by conscience, not the need for validation. One evening, the sisters approached him with a question that weighed on their minds. "What will we do next?" asked the older sister, her voice thoughtful. "Where will we go from here?" The man smiled gently. "Wherever you choose," he said. "You are free to stay, to explore, or to leave for another place. The choice is yours alone." The sisters considered this for a long moment. Freedom was unfamiliar, and with it came responsibility and uncertainty. Yet, for the first time, the idea of choice was exhilarating rather than frightening. They began to make plans, small at first, a trip to the nearby town, organizing their own tools, learning skills they had been denied before. Each choice strengthened their sense of independence. As time passed, the sisters grew more confident. They learned to navigate challenges on their own, solving problems that once would have required direction. Their laughter became more frequent, their voices more assured. The land, once heavy with silence and tension, now felt alive with possibility. The man watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. He understood that the unthinkable act of granting freedom was only the beginning. True liberation required patience, guidance, and trust. He did not force decisions, he did not demand respect. He offered support, encouragement, and space. And in return, the sisters blossomed, their courage growing with every choice they made. Months later, the settlement began to change as well. Some neighbors, once critical, began to recognize the strength in fairness and respect. They saw that the sisters, though newly freed, were capable, hardworking, and intelligent. A few began to adopt small changes in their own behavior, inspired by what they had witnessed. The man understood that change spreads slowly, quietly, and often without acknowledgement, but it spreads nonetheless. One day, the sisters decided to explore beyond the land. They packed their belongings, checked their supplies, and prepared for a short journey to a nearby town. The man watched them leave, a mixture of pride and concern filling his chest. This was the moment they had been preparing for, a step into a wider world, guided by their own choices. Before they left, the older sister turned to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting us, for giving us a chance to decide. We will not forget this." The younger sister nodded, eyes shining. "We will carry this with us always." The man smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. The journey had been difficult and the road ahead uncertain, but he knew that the choices he had made were just. Freedom, once given and respected, could grow into strength, courage, and hope. As the sisters disappeared into the distance, the man turned back to the land, standing tall and steady. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the promise of change and the quiet reminder that courage is not measured by applause or recognition, but by the willingness to stand for what is right, even when it is difficult. In the years that followed, the sisters flourished. They built lives of their own choosing, full of dignity and independence. They remembered the man not as a hero, but as someone who had seen them as people when no one else did, and had given them the most precious gift of all, choice. The man remained on the land, carrying the lessons of that time with him. He knew that doing the right thing was rarely easy and often lonely, but it was always worth it. He had faced fear, stood against expectation, and acted with courage. And in doing so, he had changed lives forever, not only theirs but his own. The story closed quietly without fanfare because true courage does not seek recognition. It is measured in the lives it touches, in the freedom it fosters, and in the knowledge that even in a world that often chooses silence, one person can make a difference. And so the land, once heavy with fear and silence, became a place of quiet hope, where freedom could grow, choices mattered, and the unthinkable act of kindness became a story remembered for generations.